And with us at the roundtable this week is Jim McArdle from Plattsburgh, who has written a new book about living and working in Libya. Nice to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you.
Libya is really in a state of turmoil these days after the overthrow and the fall of the Gaddafi regime back in 2011.
Right. It's a mess. There are two opposing forces, basically, the pro-democracy, pro-Western forces that were instrumental in the beginning. And then there are the Islamic forces, which are some bordering on Al-Qaeda, others more moderate. But so the country is divided up into many states with, or many areas with tribal groups and militias controlling these. The Zintan group, which was the big one in the west, and they're the ones that captured Salah al-Islam Gaddafi, Gaddafi's second oldest son, and who seemed to be his heir apparent, and they're holding him. And then another son who escaped to Niger is held by the Islamic forces. He was turned over by Niger to the Islamic forces. So, and up in Benghazi, it's an interesting place because that's where the revolution started. And this was very anti-Gaddafi country. He really had no use for the East, and I don't know if it was because the king was from south of Benghazi or not, or he just had an anathema toward them. And there's a colonel up there, a general now, he's now a general, or he's a self-appointed general. His name is Khalifa Haftar, and he's an interesting guy. He was part of the coup that overthrew the king in 1969. He was probably a second lieutenant or a lieutenant at the time, and he was part of Gaddafi's inner circle, and his commander of his forces, commander, chief of staff, and then he was fighting in Chad. I didn't get into a lot of this in the book because I talked about what I did there, and he eventually was captured by him and almost his entire unit of about 900 men were captured by the Chad forces, and Gaddafi kind of like just disowned him and said he didn't even know he was there. So this infuriated Khalifa, and he went over to the Chad side, and then the Chad government was overthrown, and to make a long story short, the CIA got involved along with the French, and they got him released, and he was given sanction in Zaire for a while, and then Kenya, and then the U.S., to their credit, Gaddafi came back and gave a pardon to all those that wanted to come back, and about half of them did, and the other half, about 300 or 400, came to the United States, and they went to all different places in the States, and Colonel Haftar stayed in the Northern Virginia area, and of course we all know what's there, Langley, and he had an export-import business and became an American citizen, and then when the fighting started, he returned to Libya to get involved with the forces, and I think he was like third in command, and then the commander-in-chief of the Libyan army deserted to the rebel cause, and he was assassinated by somebody in the rebels, and Haftar took over, and he right now controls about half of Benghazi. Islamic forces control the other half, and the Egyptians and the UAE and others are supporting the freely elected government, which is no longer in Tripoli. They fled Tripoli because the Islamists gained control of Tripoli and the airport where the Zintan group was. And they are sitting in session in Tobruk, which is right on the Egyptian border.
So many factions.
Yeah,
now,
and they and the Islamist group is in the non-elected group. The original non-elected group is sitting in a parliament in Tripoli, but the world community recognizes the original government, which is in Tobruk, and the United Nations ambassador is, part of that government. So it's a real mess, and the thing that's scary is they're so well armed because Gaddafi. I mean, the armories were just. The soldiers basically took off their uniforms and either joined the rebel cause or took their AK-47s and went home with them.
So this was part of the Arab Spring, and in 2011 spread from Egypt Tunisia and into Libya. Started in Benghazi in the east and took, I guess, several months for the rebel forces to force their way into Tripoli and eventually
Right.
captured and murdered Gaddafi. And now a lot of Muslim extremists basically are fighting for control of the country.
Well, the city of Derna, which sits between Benghazi and Tobruk, about 80,000 people, is in the hands of an ISIS-affiliated group, Al Qaeda, ISIS. You know, they're all the same, and so that's a big issue. And the thing that's interesting is that in Iraq, I think I mentioned it in the book, is that more people per capita came from Libya to fight against the Americans in Iraq than from any other country except Saudi Arabia, and more people per capita from a representative area the size of Derna, 80,000 people, came from that place than any other place in the world. So when the war ended, and when Al Qaeda was initially driven out of Iraq, all those foreign fighters returned home, and all the Libyans returned back to Libya and joined the Al Qaeda of the Maghreb, or some anti-Gaddafi force, and that's the state we're in right now. But Gaddafi would have never been overthrown had it not been, well, the French and the British got in initially, and they dragged in Obama, and it was my opinion that it was we're the ones that made the difference, because we had the low-flying aircraft, the Apache helicopters, and the drones, and it was one of those planes that took out Gaddafi's 4x4 in Sirte, and then he was captured and shot point blank by one of the captors.
Through the years, Gaddafi had the relations between the U.S. and Libya. At times, Gaddafi was an ally. At other times, he was certainly a hated man. And when you were first there in the late 70s, Gaddafi had just taken over maybe a decade earlier, had taken control of the country. How were the relations with the U.S. when you first got there in the late 70s?
There was an embassy. I think it had been relegated to a consulate. So there was a consulate there, and it was on a side street, a very innocuous area. This was during the Carter administration. Later, it was closed, and but the Libyans were allowed to remain in Washington in an embassy, although it was considered downgraded to a consulate. And it wasn't until they called it the People's Bureau. This was Gaddafi's thing when he had these people committee meetings, and I talked about it in the book, how he was going to replace the tribes. It's a tribal society, very, very strong tribal society. It goes back 2,000-3,000 years at least, and that's what's going on today. Are these tribes? They stick together, and so he was going to replace that with these People's Bureau and these People's Committee and all this sort of stuff, and it failed. And he recognized it. And the same thing happened in Iraq when Paul Bremer went in and he made the statement, the tribal system is ended, which was a foolish statement to make. And but Gaddafi quickly saw that he couldn't do it. I mean, it was impossible. So he went along with the tribes and played one off against the other. And so then the rebellion, when it came about in Benghazi, the rebellion actually was led by doctors and lawyers and nurses and not military people. And the other thing too is that the army just kind of disappeared. The army was never strong to begin with, as opposed to Egypt, where the army was a well-respected and loved institution. In fact, many Egyptians considered that that they won the 1973 war, because they captured the whole Sinai initially. In Tunisia, same thing. When the revolt started there, the army stood back, and they were respected. But in Libya, the army had no such power. So Gaddafi's power rested with militias that he had organized, and many of these were indigenous black folks who came from the sub-Sahara region, along the Chad, Niger, Mali, Algerian border. And so they formed the core of his armed forces around him. And so the army was, for all intents and purposes, not even there, except when they took off their uniforms and went home. And then the armories just opened up and everybody grabbed, and there were armories all over the country, as you can imagine. And they didn't only grab just light weapons, they had heavy artillery, and I mean, because he had an unbelievable amount of armaments that and mainly from the Russians. My opinion is if Obama, and I think Mendeleev was still the prime minister of Russia at the time, had they been able to talk to Gaddafi and maybe work out some kind of a deal with the rebels, it might not have worked, but it could have been an alternative to what happened. So it's not good. And as I said in the book, Libya's got so much potential. Like right now, they're having to dip into their foreign reserve because they're not pumping any oil. And during the war, to their credit, they did not try to blow up the pipelines or blow up the refineries or any of that sort of stuff. But now there is shooting, and occasionally a rocket will hit a storage facility. Not so much in Misrata, which is the main point. And that's another city that's the third largest city, and they have one of the strongest militias around, and they are moderate Islamists, from what I've gathered, and they control the airport now in Tripoli.
There wasn't nearly as much turmoil back in the late 70s when you went there. Now, you worked for Harris Corporation.
I did. Harris RF Communications, yeah.
Based in Rochester, New York, primarily manufacturing communications equipment.
Yes, strategic radio equipment designed for military, but also commercial purposes, like oil companies, like in the Gulf and in Brunei, where all the oil is out on these platforms, and they need really good, sophisticated HF or VHF radio.
Reliable communications.
Right.
And Libya, back in the day, one of the biggest deals that you negotiated and worked on through these years was a huge contract for Libya's Navy.
Right.
To provide them with communications equipment.
And buildings. So we got into the construction business. And
buildings to house the equipment.
Yes.
Yes.
So when they bought all this equipment in 1976, they only had a Navy headquarters in Tripoli, which was the old Wheelus Air Base. And almost anybody that was in the Air Force around here, especially because we can relate to Plattsburgh, and it was a career type, would have been at Wheelus. It was the largest air base outside the continental U.S. of A., bigger than Clark in the Philippines. And I knew some people from my hometown that were retired that had been at Wheelus. But anyway, that's where the Navy headquarters was part of the old Wheelus Air Base, and right on the Mediterranean, and beautiful. And I talk about Leptis Magna in there too, and that's the Roman ruins of Leptis Magna, right on the Mediterranean, about 70 miles east of Tripoli. And and they had a Navy headquarters building in Benghazi, and they had a Navy building in Tobruk, but they had no buildings to house their transmit and receive equipment. So that's what we provided. And they were Barco-prudent buildings. You said you've been to Chateauguay. Have you ever seen the fire station in Chateauguay?
Yes.
That's a Barco-prudent building.
Okay.
So that would be that's a big building. That would be the size, close to the size of what these buildings were that we were putting up. And it was a huge job. I mean, you're putting these buildings up on sand, and we didn't have a construction company. And we had, the project manager found this Libyan guy who had, 3 or 4 lorries and a backhoe that he could pull stuff around, and 4 or 5 donkeys that he had out on the site pulling steel around. And it was so finally we got some engineers in there and got some construction people in, and finally it evolved. We got he was from Grenada, a Grenadan Brit, and he was in Libya doing construction work, and he was able to organize people out of the UK that were skilled masons, plumbers, electricians,
Yep.
you know, all the things that you need to have a construction company. And they came in and finally got the job straightened out, but it was painful.
This was a multi-million-dollar deal.
Yeah, both the Navy equipment was $10 million, the building contract was $10 million.
Were you one of the few American companies in Libya at the time?
Yes. Well, the oil companies were there.
The oil companies were there.
You
But
know,
were-
Amerada Hess and Arm & Hammer's company and Mobil. In fact, one of the most notable scenes in downtown Tripoli, right there in the square, was the Flying Red Horse of Mobil. It was the largest structure on the horizon. That was the Mobil headquarters building.
You lived there and you made several trips there because these deals took years
Yes.
to work out, to negotiate, to get the financing approved, to get the letters of credit, to arrange the shipping, the training, spare parts. These were very complicated deals, and that's why you ended up spending so many years in Libya to see them through.
Following up with the customer, our prime customer was the Libyan Army Signal Corps. They made all the decisions regarding, you know, any kind of communications equipment that came in there. Because Gaddafi, interestingly enough, came out of the Signal Corps. That's what he was. He was a signals officer, trained in the UK. What I'm told by people who knew him, he spoke fluent English, very, very good English. He, you know, learned it in school in Libya and further at the military academy in Benghazi, and then in the UK where he was being trained. And the commander of the Signal Corps, whom I knew very well, and I talk about him in the book, he was trained in the U.S. at Fort Monmouth in New Jersey. That facility is now in Florida, the signals training. So Gaddafi did. He spoke good English. He wouldn't speak English. He probably did when Condi Rice was there or something like that. But
He knew how to.
yeah, he knew how to charm when it came to things like that. But he was described by some as a manic depressant. You know, well, remember when he came to the States, he pitched his tent over in New Jersey, and
Right.
he did the same thing, I think, in Paris. I mean, it was, you know, part clown, but, you know, pretty clever.
How tough was the job there? You had to deal with military leaders from Libya. You had to deal with the government, getting approval, getting procurement. How tough was it to get these deals through and dealing with so many different parties?
It was difficult. Of course, they were always looking, you know, for a drop in the price.
Was corruption rampant? Were they always looking for something for themselves, some of them?
Very subtly, yes.
Yeah.
Very subtly. Initially, the way the process worked is I would put together a pro forma invoice with all the equipment that they wanted. The advisors, the Chinese nationals, would look it over, and they always wanted Craftsman tools, and because they swore they were the best. And I've heard both sides, but I'm sure but they have a name, so they had to do the job. And so that we'd always get $3,000 or $4,000 worth of Craftsman tools in the contract. They insisted on that. And it's ironic because Sears was on the boycott list. So here we are, but the Libyans really didn't pay any attention to that. You know, they were far enough removed from Israel to, Gaddafi always spoke big about, you know, taking on Israel and this, that, and the other thing, but he really didn't have any love for the Palestinians or Arafat or any of that stuff. So, so we sold them these spare parts that were on the boycott list. Now, you couldn't sell those in Saudi Arabia. They wouldn't go. I mean, and there were no Ford cars there, but that's only because Gaddafi had been pretty much cut off commercially from the U.S. because. But there was another deal that came through that was very interesting. Oshkosh trucks make huge trucks. My dad was superintendent of highways. I remember they had Oshkosh trucks in the rolling stock. They had a big deal. It was over $100 million worth of trucks that they were going to buy. And the U.S. government this was during the Carter administration, and when I was in Libya. They said they could only be configured in such a way so that they couldn't carry or tow tanks or heavy artillery pieces or that sort of stuff. And one day I was at Central Bank of Libya following up on a letter of credit, and I happened to go out I was on the front steps getting ready to leave, and these big trucks came rolling through, and they were Oshkosh trucks. And one of the tarps blew up, and on the back were, all kinds of rockets, and and then behind them came the Toyota trucks, and they were huge trucks, but they were dwarfed by these Oshkosh trucks.
Yeah. In the book, you talk about all the hoops you had to jump through. It just seems one headache after another, dealing with the military, dealing with the government, dealing back here with the State Department and the states and financing and everything. How much did politics play into it? Was that part of it as well? Did you have to carefully dance around and deal with the politics of the time?
No, not really. As I mentioned in the book, the Treasury Department had one set of guidelines as far as the boycott clause, and the Treasury Department and the Commerce Department had another set of requirements, and they differed. And it's crazy. But the banks were really the most pragmatic people of all. The banks in the U.S., the banks in Tripoli, the banks in Riyadh, the banks in Cairo, that they all came together on a set of language that the Treasury Department agreed to. And so Commerce was kind of in a position where, they couldn't really object to much, because then you're hurting a company's business, yeah. and you get foreign tax credits for selling overseas and promoting jobs here in the States and selling that stuff abroad. So it worked out pretty well. In the crazy one was the last one that I mentioned in the book, when I went into Tripoli, and where I tell about my being without a passport. Yes. And going through immigration, and that was the crazy one, because even though we had a letter of credit, getting an export license was going to be very difficult, because President Reagan had already put Gaddafi on the top of the bad guys list, and cut off all commercial ties except for food and medicine. And so but I had signed that contract, or I did the pro forma. When I was out of country, I think our in-country manager signed the contract. It was signed before President Reagan told all the Americans to get out of Libya. That was like in August or early September of 1981.
You made a number of connections through the years. You found a way to deal with all of these people to try to move these deals along. As you got into the late 70s and early 80s, as we went from the Carter administration to the Reagan administration, things did start to change, and there were a number of things that happened that made your life there more difficult.
Yeah, and of course our competition was going around telling everybody that we couldn't get export licenses, and
you couldn't deliver. You couldn't get the equipment there. Yeah,
and this was an issue I faced, especially in the end. And I left there in late December of 1982 was when I left for the final time, and I had all kinds of pro forma invoices in the works with different groups, NTC, the Signal Corps, Secretary Liaison, which was Gaddafi's group, and I signed a big contract for them with around it came out to around $10 million.
When you left in 1982, the U.S. had shot down 2 Libyan jets.
Yes, over the Gulf of Sirte. Yep.
The U.S. Embassy had closed in Libya.
They closed. President Reagan in July, which is when I left for a year from the job and was working in Saudi and the Middle East. When President Reagan closed them down, he kicked them out. In that time frame, he gave them 24 hours to get out of the country.
So the Americans were told to get out. You still continued to go there a few more times. You had to get special permission to continue on to try to wrap up that deal.
Yes, I had to get a stamp on my passport in London that said this man is allowed. There's a picture of it in the book. Allowed to go into Libya for 30 days and must exit by a certain date in December of '82. And so I got that, but I had no visa on my passport. Now, I could have gone over to the Libyan embassy in London probably, or gone to Malta, because I knew the ambassador in Malta, the Libyan ambassador, and gotten a visa, but I didn't. I went into the country thinking that maybe the Navy could get me through, and they did. They had our guys had a letter at the airport, but they wouldn't honor it. And the captain in immigration said, "I'm going to hold your passport. You're going to have to go to immigration and get this sorted out." And I did, and I knew what it was going to be like to begin with. And I didn't mention this in the book, but talking about down there in immigration and motor vehicle and that sort of stuff. I remember the story of a guy that he went down there for his license, and when he was there, two young men, and he thought it was their father or grandfather, came in, and they were coming in for their licenses, and the grandfather was blind, and he was coming in for his automobile license. But anyway, I just had to mention that before I forgot. But getting back to that immigration deal, I said, this isn't going to work, me getting in line. There were people from the Sudan, from Niger, from all over, because Libya was a place that they could get a job, in the oil business or cleaning the streets or whatever. Yeah. And so I just started going up the stairs, and I got to this, I don't know, maybe the second floor, third floor, and I just happened to look in this office, and there's a guy sitting there, and I knew him. I said, "Hey, kif halik? Salam alaikum." All the get to know one another and renew your friendship statements. And I said, "Hey," he said, "How are you?" I said, "I'm good." He says, "Come down and see me." He was at Africa Trade, which I mentioned in the book. And I said, "I will." I said, "Right now I've got a big problem." I said, "My passport's at the airport. I'm here to get this contract finalized with the Signal Corps and get some designations as to where the equipment will be shipped." And he said, "Don't worry about it. Sit down. Have a cup of coffee." I did. I just happened to be in the office of the head of immigration, and this guy was there shooting the bull with him. And so we sat, talked. The colonel talked, and he sat down, wrote out a letter. When I reflect back on it, I can't believe it happened this quickly. I mean, something like this could never happen here, or even in Canada, where you get things done pretty efficiently, or in Europe. And I had the letter, and I went back to the airport. The guy from the office gave me a ride back, and to the airport. And I went in, and I ran into the captain, and I said, "Captain, I have the letter." He said, "Oh, good." He said, "Now I'll put a visa on your passport." I said, "Why don't we just let that go if this letter's good enough?" He said, "Yeah, the letter will be okay."
Yeah. So luckily you got that. Luckily your connections
got you. Probably what would have happened is I'd have gone back to the airport, if I couldn't have gotten it.
Yeah.
And he just said, "Okay, you're going to have to leave the country."
Yeah.
I don't think I'd have been thrown in jail or anything. But here in the States, a friend of mine who was a deputy soup up at Dannemora was telling me that they had a guy up there who had come through customs. I think he was from either Afghanistan or Pakistan. He hadn't done anything criminal or anything like that, but he was here illegally. And they sent him to a high security prison. And he was not a threat or anything, but that's how
it would have been handled differently.
Yeah, if I'd have been a Libyan and that would have happened, I'd have wound up in Dannemora.
Yeah. So with relations deteriorating, you had to go back and wrap up that deal.
Yes.
Did you feel in danger at any point, or were you worried about your safety at all?
No. I had good relations with the people at the hotel, and the hotel was run by the military. The young guys that were there were probably draftees who worked the front desk and all that sort. I always brought them in something. No, I never really did feel threatened at all.
And you were fortunate you were able to wrap up the deal, finally get the financing hammered out, the spare parts, the delivery, and so you left in the early '80s before I guess you could say that the relations between the U.S. and Libya obviously got even worse during the '80s with the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 and for a number of years. You went from Libya then to Saudi Arabia. You changed companies. You eventually left the Harris Corporation.
I left in early February. Oh, I had one more deal that I did in Libya. It was with a company called Bonaventure. I think I mentioned that.
You did it. Named after the hotel in Montreal.
Named after the hotel in Montreal. Good for you. These were Canadian. This was a Canadian guy, and he was working with Africa Trade, and it was $1 million deal that myself and one of the European salesmen completed with the guy over a couple of beers at the airport in Rochester, and that we were able to get an export license. I mean, it came after I left, and so that was the final deal. And then, I saw the handwriting on the wall, and I could have stayed. I could have been given another. I also had West Africa too, but there was hardly a nickel to pinch in that whole area, except in Botswana, where I got a deal before I left, or it came in after I left, but it was about $1.5 million for the Botswanan Army Signal Corps. And but that was one of our lesser territories. So I had West Africa and Libya and Malta. And then I joined AT&T International, which was part of Western Electric, which later became Network Systems when the divestiture occurred in January 1st, 1984. And I went to Saudi Arabia as manager of contracts and subcontracts for a $380 million microwave expansion job that they were putting in for the Ministry of Post, Telephone, and Telegraph.
So that was another major deal.
Major deal. And then we got another big contract for an Earth satellite system in Riyadh, or in Jeddah, also with the MOPTT. And so that was big. And I was there for 3.5 to 4 years. And then I went to Canada for 3 years, 3 great years, and wound up back in Rochester in sales. And then the company came out with an early out program, and I took that, got some money, got some time on my retirement, and I'm retired from AT&T.
So before you went to AT&T, before you left Harrison, went to AT&T, and then went to Saudi Arabia, those years in Libya, would you say they were the highlight of your career?
They certainly. That's where I learned. That's where I learned on my feet, and with the guy that I mentioned, with the man that I mentioned that was my mentor, who taught me the ropes in there. But it's an area of the world where patience must be a virtue, and Saudi is even more. The Saudis, even though I enjoyed great years there with AT&T and with Lucent Technologies, they were difficult.
Because these are hostile territories.
Yeah, and the
Saudis
Saudis were our friends, but they were hard to deal with.
Yeah.
Plus, they had advisors, who worked for them. Now, it could have been a British company, it could have been an Italian company, might even have been some Americans. And so, these advisors want to keep their job going as long as they can. So that was a hurdle that you had to do. The Libyans, we didn't have that problem.
After that big contract with the Libyans, did Harris continue doing business there for a number of years, or was that almost really the end of it for Harris?
That was the end of it, that last contract that I got. And it wasn't until 2004, I believe, when Gaddafi saw what happened to Saddam Hussein, and he made a deal with the U.S. and Libya were already working together on anti-terrorist things, because Gaddafi was threatened as much or maybe even more than we were.
In later years, under the Bush administration, they worked together fighting al-Qaeda.
Yes, they did. And then in 2004, they established commercial relations and exchange embassies, and things just dramatically changed. But then,
and did that open it up for American companies to go back there?
Yes. I don't know. I do know that two of Gaddafi's sons were in a big dispute over who was going to get the Pepsi franchise, and there was a shoot up on that deal. I don't think anybody got killed or anything, but it was things did change. But I think one of the things that happened was at the time that the revolution started, Sarkozy, the president of France, was in a very, very difficult race for president, and he was way behind in the polls. I'm sure this had some impetus in promoting Gaddafi as the bad guy, and the poor rebels are, just getting slaughtered. And he got Prime Minister Cameron to go along with him. And the British had supported us loyally in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and I think Obama probably felt obliged to do this, but it was like leading from behind again. Mm-hmm. And Sarkozy, the French had supported us very strongly in Afghanistan, but President Chirac previously had declined to go into Iraq. So had the Canadian Liberal government. So that's how things transpired. And actually, the revolution in Libya looked like it was going to be the best one of the three, because the thing happened. The pro-Western forces and the pro-democracy forces mm-hmm. won in the elections. The Muslim Brotherhood was shut out completely because they had played ball with Gaddafi, and then all of a sudden things just backfired. And a lot of resentment was felt toward the Libyans, and there was many Libyans living here in the States. Yep. A lot of them in academia. Yep.
You talk about them in the book, the expats that live here in the U.S. Close friends of yours? Do you still stay in contact?
No,
with them?
I didn't know any of them. I know Libyans that lived here, but they stayed here.
Yeah, that must have still been a huge disappointment to them.
Yeah.
The hope
when they went back, they wanted to be involved in this resurgence, this new government, this great opportunity, and then these ones who had stayed there and felt that they had suffered too much while these other people went to the States and lived a good life, they passed this law that said anybody who had worked for the Gaddafi government could not serve in it. Much like what Bremer did in Iraq, when he allowed the Ba'athist, anybody that belonged to the Ba'athist party couldn't work for the government. And the Ba'athist party was, if you were a scientist and you worked for the government, you had to belong to the Ba'athist party. Mm-hmm. And so that's what happened in Libya. So what happened was a lot of these people, Gaddafi, to his credit, sent a lot of Libyans abroad for college. And a lot of them came to the States and to the UK and to Australia and to Europe. And when they got their degrees, they went back, figuring that they could make a difference. But they were given jobs, but they weren't allowed to do anything.
And now they've been shut out of
and then they just packed up and came back to the States, got their green card, most likely got their citizenship. And then when the revolution started, they saw this great opportunity. They went back, and then all of a sudden they were shut out because they had worked for Gaddafi. Whether it was 2 months or 2 years, it didn't matter.
Have you gone back?
No.
You've never been back?
No. And I don't think that I'd...
Probably right now
no,
you wouldn't be able to.
Safe.
But do you have a desire to go back someday?
No. Maybe someday, but things would have to do a 100% turn.
Yeah. You had talked about how beautiful it was, though. Tripoli, right on the Mediterranean Sea, and your hotel there,
and the tourism was starting to open up. In fact, I think Gaddafi's sons were getting into the tourism business. There were cruise ships that were starting to make stops there. The two sites that I've been to, Leptis Magna and Sabratha, the Roman ruins. Leptis was restored probably 50%, and then when Gaddafi came in, he stopped all of it. Sabratha was completely restored. That's much smaller. That's west of Tripoli. And a lot of fighting that went on there too. So that they have a museum there, and they've got the ruins are all restored. Yeah. Those pictures that I have are in that's Leptis Magna.
Yeah.
It was the largest Roman colony outside of Rome. And there's some Greek ruins and Greek ruined colonies in eastern Libya, around east of Benghazi, where the Greeks settled along the coast.
Yeah. Well, you spent enough time there, you'd like to see stability return to that region.
Part of me is there. And there was, Christians could practice there. The Libyan people are not Christian, they're Muslim. But what I've read over the years is when things were going bad in Egypt and the Copts were being attacked, and this is something that didn't just happen with the Arab Spring. It's been happening over the years. A lot of Copts picked up and left and moved to Libya. Around Benghazi, they were storekeepers, they were merchants, they were in manufacturing or farming. And so I don't know what their fate is, but there was a large Catholic church that was right in the same square as my office. And you would see the Irish ambassador's car pull in there on St. Patrick's Day. And they had the Mass in English, Italian, Polish. A lot of Poles were working there because this was during the Cold War, when a lot of Eastern Europeans were working there on construction jobs. So the Monsignor, I think he's a bishop now if he's still alive, was a native Libyan of Italian descent. His mother and father lived in Libya, probably had farms there when the Italians were the colonial overseers of Libya. And he, went to seminary probably in Rome and came back to, but the main cathedral was in downtown Tripoli, right where the Flying Red Horse was. And it was right in the center of the square. So that was the center, the building and that was the Roman Catholic Cathedral. Gaddafi, when he took over, sealed the doors, took the cross down, put the minaret on top, and nothing was defiled or anything. The sacristy was on the side was open, and you could go there and get a free copy of the Quran in English, and the Green Book, which I showed you today. You could get free copies of that.
You retired and then taught business at both Clinton Community College and SUNY Plattsburgh. Nearly 35 years after you experienced your time in Libya. Why the decision to write the book?
I don't know. I thought at this time in my life it was something interesting. It was certainly the most major part of my career at that time. It got me into the international scene. I had been in the Navy and spent a lot of time overseas, circled the globe, crossed the equator about 4 or 5 times. But this was an opportunity to work overseas, and I just wanted to share my thoughts and about a place that's has a lot of potential, but that is exploding.
Published by Right One Plus in
Right One
Chateauguay,
Plus.
New York. If folks are interested in getting a copy, how can they get the book and read your book?
I can be reached by email, jmcaint at charter.net.
Okay, so email is the best, so they can get in touch with you.
Email is the best.
Well, Jim McArdle, thank you for taking the time to be with us today, and we wish you the best of luck.
Thank you very much.